In this module, we're going to take a look at working with XGen, specifically using the XGen features that are going to help us make short hair and fur. And that's also going to include facial hair, things such as beards, eyebrows, mustaches, any other kind of facial hair you can think of. So let's go ahead, jump in, and get started. Alright, so here we are. We're still working with the same asset we've been using, same animation is still there. The only difference is I've removed the bald cap because it's not really going to be relevant in this lesson. So to get started with XGen, we do need to make sure that we are in our modeling menu here and not in FX. And that's because XGen does a lot more than just create hair and fur. It can also be used for set dressing, so people can use it to generate forests and all kinds of other cool environments. Now it's going to be found here under Generate, and it'll be up at the top. You can see there's our XGen editor, library, and the different XGen options. So to go ahead and get started, I'm actually going to be using this Maya Classic workspace, but for you, I recommend you actually use the XGen workspace. This actually gives us a lot more room over here and brings all of these into tabs up top. Now, the reason I can't use this is because at this low resolution, I actually can't drag this out far enough and my options will be cut off over here. However, that's just because of my recording resolution. So I'll be using the Maya Classic interface, but I do recommend you try the XGen interface because it actually does give you a much nicer working area. So with that aside, I'll go ahead and select my model. We'll come up here to Generate and select the XGen editor. And you can see we'll be treated to this pretty little menu of grass, and we have some options. And we're going to choose to create a new description. So when I select that, I need to give it two pieces of information first, a description name and a collection name. Think of a collection as the actual human head, and a description is each individual type of hair or fur on that head. So the collection we'll call just, human head. Oops. And the description, let's say for this one, we're just going to call this one just fur test. So, but theoretically, we could have a description for eyebrows, a description for the beard, for the mustache, a description for the hair, whatever it might be. Then we need to choose the type of primitives we're creating. Now, there are 5 different types here. We're only interested in the first 2. That's because these others are for the other features that I referred to, set dressing and such. So there's splines for long hair and groomable splines for short hair. This module obviously focuses on short hair and fur, so we're going to select groomable splines. Now, these other options are now grayed out to us. Groomable splines doesn't really have any options. We have to use these two. So we'll talk about these other settings a little bit more in the next module when we cover splines, where we do actually have a choice. So I'll select my groomable splines and hit Create. And it says it's already there on disk. That's just fine. I'll go ahead and create for test 1 instead. Okay. And you can see that something has been generated. It's definitely a little strange looking. We see these yellow kind of little hairs, and we see these thicker brown hairs. So what we're seeing here are the actual previews of the render hairs as well as the groom guides. So if you take a look at these 2 little green eyeballs over here, let me go ahead and drag this out a bit more. These are what control when we actually see the renderable pieces of geometry. So if I go ahead and use the closed eyeball, we'll remove them. Then I can use the open eyeball. You can see the little exclamation tells us it's not currently updated, to show them. And the reason it's done this way is because we could theoretically have hundreds of thousands of these little renderable hairs, and if we always had to show them, especially as we're combing and manipulating, then that's really going to slow things down. So typically we go ahead and leave those off, and we'll just preview them when we need to. However, you can go over here and turn on Update Preview automatically if you always want them there and always want them updating. So let's take a quick look at the interface of XGen over here. It can look a little complicated with all these different tabs, but it's actually quite simple. Up here, we just have mostly import and export features, and we can go ahead and create new descriptions, duplicate them, move them to different collections. Over here, we can choose the collection that we're currently in, as well as the description that we're currently in. We, of course, only have one of each right now. Then up over here, for the sake of this module, we're just interested in these first 2, really. This one we can use. It creates new descriptions, but most everything else here is not really going to be affected with these groomable splines. These are going to be for the other systems. Then we have these different tabs. Primitives is going to be for controlling the actual geometry that's going to be rendered, these little primitives here. Preview and output is going to control our viewport preview settings, and it's going to control a couple of our render settings. Modifiers we'll go over later, but these are going to be almost like filters for our hair and fur. Grooming is unique just to the system we're in now, the groomable splines, and it's for controlling them. Utilities is going to be for controlling the curves inside of some of the other systems, specifically the hair systems that we'll look at in the next module. This isn't really going to help us in this current module with the grooming splines. And expressions is where we can put in our expressions, which is something that's outside the scope of this course. So for now, let's go ahead and jump back to the grooming tab. I'm also going to go ahead and hit this green eyeball to hide those hairs. And let's start by taking a look at the amount of hairs we actually have over here on the head. Now, first thing you'll notice is we actually don't have that many. So we can change this very easily. Let's take a look at how this grooming palette is laid out. Up here we have brushes, which we'll start covering in our next clip. Over here we have some editing tools, such as flipping the hair from left to right, twisting it, resetting it, clearing out masks. And then down over here are the actual settings for these groomable splines, whether they're visible or not. So you might want to hide them, for example, if you just want to see the renderable ones. There we go. And of course we have the density, where I can control how many of them I have. Now I want to talk to you briefly about this setting because it's very easy to make a mistake here. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to quickly grab one of my tools over here and I'll do some quick sculpting on his face here. We'll talk more about this tool in the next clip. But for now, I'm just going to do some quick sculpting. And then maybe I decide, well, there's maybe too much hair here. So I'm going to drop this down to maybe 40. And you'll notice all my sculpting went away. That's because every time we change this, it generates new hairs. What we can do to try to keep that from happening is choose an interpolation style here under sampling. So for example, I can choose nearest. So if I sculpt now, and then change this to, let's say, maybe even higher to 50, you could see it will keep it, or if I go to 35, it'll drop it. Just be careful because, for example, if I do drop down too low, let's say down to 10, you could see obviously many hairs have been eliminated. When we go back up, it's just looking at these hairs here and it's going to try to rebuild what was there. And you could see it can end up being a little bit stiff. We're going to actually lose quite a few of our details that we may have had in the original sculpt, or the fur sculpt, whatever you want to call it. So just be careful. It might be a good idea to try to set your density early on. Let's say I know I'm going to want roughly 45 here, and just try to stick to that. I'll go ahead and reset here to kind of put that back to the defaults. You can also try interpolate, but I find these two are very similar. Now, this sync option over here is going to link this density option to the primitives option over here. So it's going to directly increase how many primitives we actually get. Now, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. It's going to be up to you to decide if you want it. For right now, we'll go ahead and leave it on. Go ahead and eliminate that. Go back to our grooming tab. So down over here is masking. We'll talk a bit more about masks and such later. For right now, if we were to take this down, it's just going to eliminate 50% of the hairs. So we'll just go ahead and leave that on. Here you can also load in an XUV file. We'll take a look at some of those later on. We can also control the color of these here. So if I want to, for example, darken the bases to make them a little easier to see, you can see I can control that as well. So right now they're definitely very easy to see. We can also display these as either lines or cards. The upside of using cards is the fact that the cards will actually display thickness, which you can see is one of our options over here. We wouldn't be able to see that thickness if we were working with lines. Go back to, actually before we go back to cards, you can see though the downside is in certain areas they're going to appear as if they don't exist because we're going to be looking at kind of that flat side of the card. Now go back to lines. We can also adjust the length right here, which is just an overall length. As you'll probably notice up over here, we do have separate settings to actually comb the length and change the length up there. If we drop back down here, the last two options are TPU, which is going to be texels per unit. That's going to be the resolution of the texture that's produced, and the XGen system uses PTEX textures, so that's the way we measure resolution on PTEX. And then any exports for this groom are going to be sent to this groom folder based on the description folder, which is going to be over here for test 1. So that's a quick look at the overall interface here. In the next clip, let's go ahead and start working with some of these different tools. So I'll see you all there.